The sound of a pistol cocking doesn't belong on a quiet cul-de-sac where the loudest thing you usually hear is someone's leaf blower or a golden retriever barking at a squirrel. Yet that was the sound that froze the evening, followed by the shrill voice of Karen from the HOA screaming about overdue dues. Her arms stretched out, hand trembling, finger on the trigger, pointing at my daughter's chest like she was about to enforce neighborhood compliance with lethal force. Neighbors peeked through blinds, some stepped onto porches, phones half raised, torn between recording the madness and ducking for cover. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, except for my daughter who didn't even flinch. She had just parked her cruiser in front of my house, still in uniform from her shift, badge glinting faintly under the streetlight. She had one grocery bag looped over her wrist, holding a gallon of milk and a pack of Oreos, hardly the kind of supplies someone carries when preparing for a standoff. Karen didn't care. Karen, the self-appointed dictator of the subdivision, stood 5 feet away waving a gun around like she'd been waiting her whole life for a chance to use it. Her hair was sprayed stiff enough to withstand a hurricane, her HOA binder clutched in the crook of her elbow, and her voice screeched about 3 months of unpaid dues, as if that justified threatening someone's life. My daughter's response wasn't panic or fear. She tilted her head, calm as a summer pond, and simply said, "Are you really doing this?" Her voice carried down the street with such steady authority that Karen faltered. The grocery bag swayed against my daughter's leg as she set it gently on the pavement, her free hand brushing her holster though she didn't draw. She didn't need to. Something in her posture shifted, and even the neighbors who knew nothing about law enforcement could feel the change in the air. Karen kept shouting about rules, about community standards, about how no one gets exceptions. The absurdity of it cracked through the tension, because here was a woman risking prison time over lawn care fines and mailbox paint. Yet Karen was deadly serious, cheeks red, eyes darting, voice trembling, as if she'd convinced herself that she was the last line of defense for suburban order. She waved that pistol like she was leading a one-woman revolution against delinquency. The silence broke with the first laugh. It came from old Mr. Hawkins 3 doors down, the kind of man who'd lived long enough not to care what anyone thought. "Good Lord, Karen," he called out. "You're about to shoot the sheriff over $30?" A ripple of nervous chuckles followed, quickly swallowed by the crackling tension. But it was enough to puncture Karen's sense of control. She snapped her head toward the sound, screaming at Hawkins to stay out of it, giving my daughter the perfect opening. She pulled her jacket back just enough for the badge to glint, the silver star catching porch lights all around the street. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, lower and firmer, like a door locking. "Put the weapon down," she ordered. 3 words, clear, undeniable. The whole block held its breath. Karen froze, pupils widening as if she'd only just noticed the badge, as if the entire suburban drama had turned into a nightmare courtroom scene where she was the defendant. The grocery bag tipped over as my daughter took a step forward, milk rolling gently across the pavement like some absurd prop in the middle of high-stakes theater. Karen's gun hand shook harder. For a heartbeat, it seemed like she might double down, that she'd convince herself the sheriff badge was fake, that this was still her HOA kingdom to rule. Then my daughter's hand brushed her own holster again, not drawing, just reminding. Authority hung thick in the humid night air, and just like that, Karen's grip cracked. The pistol lowered, though not fully, as she sputtered excuses. "This isn't what it looks like," she stammered. I didn't mean, I was only trying to scare her." She looked around desperately for support, but the neighbors who usually rallied behind her HOA rants stayed back, glued to their porch steps. No one wanted to be tied to this. Phones were recording now, little red dots glowing like witness eyes in the dark. My daughter reached out with one hand, calm as you please, and gently took the gun from Karen's trembling fingers. It wasn't snatched or wrestled, it was surrendered. Karen still muttered about dues, still tried to wave her binder like it carried more weight than a sheriff's badge. But the moment of power had passed. The authority she clung to had evaporated, replaced by the sight of neighbors whispering, filming, shaking their heads. I stepped forward from my own porch, finally letting out the breath I'd been holding. My heart hammered in my chest, But my daughter's face was unreadable, professional, controlled. Karen tried to laugh it off, tried to pivot back into neighborhood politics. "You know how it is," she said, her voice high-pitched and brittle. "Sometimes people need a little scare to follow the rules." No one laughed with her. No one nodded in agreement. The only sound was the clink of my daughter unloading the pistol, sliding the magazine free with swift efficiency. That was the hook the neighborhood would never forget. Karen from the HOA, with her binder and her hairspray helmet, pulling a gun on the sheriff's daughter over HOA dues, only to have the entire street watch her fold. It was both terrifying and ridiculous, the kind of story that sounded made up even as it unfolded in front of us. And none of us knew then just how deep this drama would cut into the heart of the neighborhood, or how many secrets Karen's desperate act would drag into the light. The flashing blue and red lights washed over the cul-de-sac like a carnival nobody asked for. Neighbors crowded closer to their windows, while some who had been brave enough to step outside now backed away, suddenly realizing this was no longer just neighborhood drama. This was an official incident, and every second was being documented. 2 patrol cars screeched in from opposite ends of the street, tires crunching against asphalt, radios buzzing with clipped voices. My daughter didn't flinch. She still held the pistol she had calmly disarmed from Karen, and her badge glowed under the glare of headlights. For anyone still doubting who held real authority in that moment, the proof was undeniable. Karen's face told a different story. One moment she had been queen of the HOA, and the next she was a trembling homeowner trying to stuff her wayward power grab back into the box. Her words tumbled out too fast, tripping over themselves in desperation. "It's not what it looks like," she insisted, waving her binder like a shield. "I was only trying to, well, it was symbolic. Just a warning. I didn't even have a round chambered." Her voice cracked, betraying the fact that she had no clue what she was talking about. The neighbors didn't buy it, and the officers arriving on scene didn't either. The first patrol officer to step out of his cruiser, a tall man with the kind of expression carved from years of listening to nonsense, surveyed the situation. His eyes flicked to my daughter, then to the trembling woman in the middle of the street. He asked no questions because he didn't need to. The sheriff badge on my daughter's chest said more than any explanation could. Still, protocol mattered. "What's the situation?" he asked evenly, his voice carrying just enough authority to silence the nervous whispers from porches. My daughter didn't miss a beat. "This woman pointed a firearm at me over HOA dues," she said, each word crisp as stone. She held up the pistol, safely cleared, for the officers to see. The statement was absurd in its simplicity, almost comical, but the weight behind it made every neighbor swallow hard. The idea that a neighborhood dispute had escalated into felony territory was almost too much to process. Almost. Karen tried to laugh, though the sound came out high-pitched and manic. "Oh, come on. It wasn't like that. She's exaggerating. Everyone here knows me. I would never, this is all a misunderstanding. She provoked me. She's behind on her dues and I was making a point. That's all." "A point?" She waved the binder again, flipping it open to reveal highlighted sections and underlined HOA regulations, as if citing Section 3B about acceptable lawn height would somehow neutralize the fact that she had just been caught aiming a gun at a law enforcement officer. The officer closest to her took a deliberate step forward, his hand hovering near his own holster. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower that binder and keep your hands where I can see them." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen had been disarmed of the actual weapon, and now the only thing she clutched was a 3-ring binder like it was a life preserver in a storm. Across the street, whispers began to turn into open murmurs. Some neighbors shook their heads, muttering about Karen finally going too far. Others seemed torn, still loyal to the HOA leader who had browbeaten them into compliance for years. But none stepped forward to defend her, not with cameras recording from multiple angles and officers standing in the middle of the street. This was bigger than social politics now. This was law. The HOA board members, usually so loud at meetings, stood frozen like deer caught in headlights. The president, a man who had once passionately argued for uniform trash can placement, now stared at his shoes, unwilling to be tied to the woman unraveling in front of the whole block. It was as if the entire board had rehearsed their silence for this very moment, praying no one would drag them into the mess. Karen kept talking, words spilling out faster as though sheer volume could drown out reality. I've given my life to this community. Do you know how many hours I've spent making sure our lawns look good? That property values don't fall? That no one paints their shutters turquoise? And this is how I'm treated? Like a criminal. Her voice cracked again, and the bitter edge made it sound less like a defense and more like a confession. My daughter finally spoke again, not loud, but clear enough for everyone to hear. Karen, you pointed a loaded weapon at an officer of the law. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime. She didn't raise her voice, but her words carried the weight of finality. The patrol officers exchanged glances, nodding subtly. Everyone could see where this was heading. Karen's hands shook, binder rattling as loose papers fluttered out into the street. Her face shifted through disbelief, anger, and finally a thin, desperate smile. She's lying, she whispered, but it came out too soft, more to herself than to anyone else. She has to be lying. She's making me look bad because she hates the HOA. But even Karen seemed to know the performance had collapsed. Then came the gossip ripple. A couple of teenagers, bold enough to whisper loudly from their porch, said, "Man, she's done. HOA Karen's going to jail." The phrase lit up the crowd, murmurs growing louder, people nodding, some even smirking. Karen heard it too, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and fury. Her image as untouchable queen of the subdivision was dissolving in real time, and she had no control over it. The officers moved in closer, one reading her rights with the quiet efficiency of routine. Neighbors gasped softly as if the words themselves were fireworks going off. Karen's binder slipped from her grasp, clattering to the asphalt like the final gavel in a courtroom. Yet even as the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists, she tried one last angle. "You'll regret this," she shrieked, her voice breaking. "You think this ends with me? The HOA doesn't forget. You'll all regret it." The words echoed through the night, somewhere between a threat and a prophecy. My daughter stayed steady, but I saw her eyes flick toward me, just for a second. It was a silent message. This wasn't over. She knew, and I knew, that Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. There was something in her desperation, in the way she screamed about the HOA like it was more than just a neighborhood committee. Something deeper, something dangerous. As Karen was led to the back of the cruiser, the neighborhood began to unravel in chatter. Some people shouted questions at the officers, others filmed close-ups, narrating for their social media followers. But beneath the surface-level chaos, an unease began to grow. If Karen had been willing to pull a gun over dues, what else was festering under the surface of this pristine subdivision? What secrets had been hiding behind the manicured hedges and pastel shutters? The patrol cars pulled away, taillights vanishing into the night, leaving silence in their wake. The cul-de-sac was left with nothing but the faint smell of gasoline, the image of Karen's binder papers scattered across the pavement, and a gnawing sense that things would never go back to normal. My daughter bent down, picked up the spilled gallon of milk, and carried it toward me. She didn't say anything at first, just gave me a tired half-smile as if to say, "Welcome to the fallout." When she finally spoke, it was almost casual, but the edge in her voice was sharp. That wasn't just a meltdown, that was desperation. She knows something's coming. Her words hung in the air long after, settling heavier than any threat Karen had screamed. The night wasn't over, it had just started writing a story none of us were ready for. The morning after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood had the eerie calm of a battlefield after smoke clears. Lawns glistened with dew, sprinklers ticked in rhythm, birds chirped as if nothing had happened. But the people inside their houses weren't fooled. Curtains twitched as neighbors checked if Karen had magically reappeared on her porch with her binder and her usual threats. Gossip had replaced the morning coffee. Phones buzzed with group texts, theories, and clips of the incident. Some had already made it onto local social media pages. The whole county was buzzing about the HOA Karen who pulled a gun on the sheriff's daughter. My daughter, however, wasn't treating this like gossip. She sat at the kitchen table, uniform crisp, badge gleaming, sipping her coffee in silence while flipping through notes. I could see the gears turning in her head. She wasn't satisfied with Karen's meltdown being chalked up as neighborhood theatrics. There was a weight to her eyes, as though she'd caught the scent of something larger. She finally looked up at me and said, "She wasn't just crazy, Dad. She was scared. People who are scared like that are usually protecting something." The first clue came sooner than either of us expected. By late morning, several neighbors reported strange envelopes shoved into their mailboxes. No stamps, no return address, just folded white envelopes with typed notes inside. Each note was the same. "The HOA is lying. Follow the money." It was unsigned, cryptic, but enough to spark panic. One neighbor, Mrs. Patel, showed us hers on her porch, wringing her hands. "It was there at sunrise," she whispered, as if the hedges might be bugged. "Someone must have walked the whole street in the middle of the night." My daughter frowned, scanning the note. "Karen mentioned the HOA like it was bigger than her," she said quietly. "Looks like she wasn't bluffing." She tucked the paper into her pocket and asked if anyone else had gotten one. By noon, half the block admitted they had. Some were frightened, others were thrilled at the idea of scandal, but no one knew what to do about it. The HOA board stayed strangely silent, issuing no official statement, which only made the tension thicker. That afternoon, the board finally broke their silence with a hastily called meeting in the community center. Normally, these meetings were about bickering over pool schedules and mailbox paint colors, but this one had a different air. The parking lot was packed, people streaming inside like it was the trial of the century. The board members sat stiffly at the front, faces pale and tight, shuffling papers that no one believed were important. The president cleared his throat and said, "In light of recent events, we want to reassure the community that the HOA remains financially stable and committed to safety." The words hung in the air, hollow and defensive. My daughter sat at the back of the room, arms folded, listening carefully. She leaned toward me and muttered, "That was way too specific. Nobody asked about money yet." She was right. The board had just revealed the one thing they didn't want people thinking about. And just like that, suspicion bloomed in the crowd. Questions flew faster than the board could swat them down. Where are our dues going? Why hasn't the new playground been finished? Why did Karen act like her life depended on collecting fees? The board members fumbled through answers, sweating under the fluorescent lights, their smiles brittle. Then came the first twist. A man in the crowd, someone who had never spoken up before, stood and raised his voice. His name was Carl, a quiet accountant who lived 2 streets over. He held up one of the anonymous notes and said, "They're not lying. I used to help with the books before Karen pushed me out. The numbers don't add up. Thousands are missing." The room erupted. People gasped, others shouted. The board tried to drown him out, but it was too late. The seed had sprouted into full-blown suspicion. The drama only escalated when one of the board members, a woman named Denise, suddenly stood up and stormed out. She didn't answer questions, didn't look at anyone. She just grabbed her bag and bolted like the room had caught fire. Neighbors whispered frantically, following her with their eyes, and my daughter scribbled something in her notebook. "That's our leak," she said softly. "Either she planted those letters, or she's trying to get out before the truth does." That night, the neighborhood was restless. Porch lights stayed on, curtains never closed. People lingered outside with their phones in hand. A storm brewed above, thunder rolling in the distance, as if the weather itself was echoing the tension. Around midnight, a crash shattered the uneasy calm. A rock had been thrown through the Patel family's front window, and taped to it was another note, "Stop asking questions." The entire block jolted awake. Some thought it was a prank, others swore it was a warning. Either way, no one slept easy. By morning, Karen's meltdown no longer felt like the climax of the story but the opening act. My daughter moved with sharper purpose now, speaking less, watching more. She knocked on doors, asked neighbors about any suspicious activity, pressed them about the board's behavior. Pattern began to form. Payments were being redirected, maintenance fees, doubled with no proof of work, and contractors supposedly hired to fix things never showed up. The HOA wasn't just mismanaging, it was bleeding money. Then came the second twist, a personal one. While going through the scattered binder Karen had dropped during her arrest, my daughter found something tucked in the back pocket. Photocopies of checks written to a shell company. The signature at the bottom wasn't Karen's. It was the HOA president's. And the amounts were staggering. Thousands upon thousands funneled out of the community fund into an account that didn't exist in any directory. It explained everything. Karen's desperation, the board's silence, the sudden appearance of anonymous notes. She hadn't been defending dues out of loyalty. She had been defending her part in covering up fraud. But what shook us both was the realization that she hadn't been the mastermind. She was just a pawn in a larger scheme. By the end of Chapter 3 of this drama, the neighborhood was divided into camps. Those who wanted to bury the whole mess to protect property values, and those who wanted the truth out no matter what. My daughter stood squarely in the second camp, but she knew it wouldn't be simple. People like Karen didn't scream threats about the HOA not forgetting unless they had backup. Somewhere behind the suburban politeness, behind the neatly trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes, there was someone bigger pulling strings. And as thunder rolled across the sky again that night, my daughter whispered what I'd been too afraid to say out loud. This isn't about dues anymore, it's about control. And they're not going to give it up without a fight. By the time Chapter 4 of this saga began, the neighborhood had transformed from manicured suburbia into something closer to a Cold War battleground. Conversations that once circled around lawn care and block parties now buzzed with suspicion, whispers about money laundering, and late-night door knocks no one wanted to admit they'd received. The HOA, once feared only for its passive-aggressive letters and fines about trash cans, now loomed like a shadowy cartel. And at the center of it all was my daughter, standing steady while the rest of us wavered between fear and fury. It was her idea to call a full neighborhood assembly. She said the longer people stayed divided, the stronger the HOA board's grip would be. They thrived on fear, on neighbors too timid to question them. So she arranged for everyone to gather at the same community center where Karen had once reigned with her binder and rulebook. Word spread fast, and by the evening the place was packed. Every chair was taken. People lined the walls. Even kids sat cross-legged on the floor, wide-eyed as though the drama unfolding around them had outgrown the bedtime stories their parents tried to tell. The meeting began almost civilly, with neighbors raising concerns about the missing money and the threatening notes. But civility evaporated the moment the HOA president stood and delivered his practiced smile. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not overreact. There has been no fraud, no conspiracy, just clerical errors and rumors spread by people with personal grudges. Please, let's remember our community spirit. His words oozed charm, but they landed like acid on a crowd that had lost its patience. Then my daughter stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She pulled out the photocopied checks she had found hidden in Karen's binder and laid them on the podium like trump cards. Clerical errors don't funnel thousands of dollars into shell companies, she said calmly. These signatures are yours. Gasps rippled through the room. The president froze, his jaw tightening as color drained from his face. The power shift was instant. He was no longer in control of the narrative, and he knew it. The drama reached a fever pitch when Denise, the board member who had stormed out of the last meeting, stood up again. But this time she didn't leave. She raised her voice above the noise, tears brimming in her eyes. It's true, she confessed. We've been covering it up for years. Karen was supposed to keep everyone quiet, but she lost control. I couldn't take it anymore. Her words hit like a bomb. Half the room erupted in shouts. The other half sat stunned into silence. For the first time, the ugly truth had cracked open, and the rot spilled out in full view. But betrayal rarely comes with just one face. While Denise confessed, another board member, quiet, soft-spoken Mr. Riley, suddenly lunged forward, snatching the papers from the podium. In a flash, he bolted for the door, clutching the evidence like it was the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. Chaos erupted. People shouted. Some tried to block him, but he was quick. My daughter didn't hesitate. She was quicker. She cut across the room, intercepting him near the exit, her presence alone enough to stop him cold. She didn't need to draw her weapon. Her authority slammed into him harder than any wall. He froze, panting, caught between fight and surrender, and eventually chose the latter. The papers were returned to the podium, but the message was clear. The HOA wasn't going down without a fight. And that was when things spiraled into outright chaos. The president snapped, pounding his fist on the table, shouting over the noise. "You people don't understand. Without us, this neighborhood collapses. Do you think the county will protect your property values? Do you think anyone else cares about this street? We built this place. We kept it safe. You're nothing without us." His words, meant to rally, instead stripped away the mask. The board had stopped pretending they were benevolent leaders. They saw themselves as rulers, and the neighborhood as their kingdom. Neighbors shouted back, demanding accountability, threatening lawsuits, calling for the police. But then, as if on cue, the lights flickered and went out. Gasps filled the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming somewhere in the dark. People panicked, stumbling, some screaming. My daughter's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Stay calm. Phones up. Lights on." In seconds, dozens of flashlight beams pierced the darkness, revealing scattered chairs, toppled coffee cups, and a back door swinging open. The president was gone. That was the turning point. The HOA wasn't just corrupt. They were cornered animals now, desperate enough to vanish into the night rather than face the truth. My daughter quickly restored order, organizing neighbors, calling in officers, ensuring no one else slipped away. But the damage was done. Trust had shattered. The neighborhood realized they weren't just living under petty tyrants with binders. They were living under a system that would do anything to hold on to power. The fallout spread faster than anyone could contain. By the next morning, half the board had resigned, leaving their houses dark, cars gone from driveways, mail piling up. Rumors swirled that they'd skipped town, running from the scandal. But others whispered something darker, that they hadn't left willingly, that someone higher up had silenced them. My daughter didn't dismiss it. She started digging deeper, pulling records, tracing the shell companies linked to the checks. What she uncovered chilled her. The money wasn't just disappearing. It was being funneled into accounts tied to developers and businesses far outside our little suburb. This wasn't just neighborhood corruption. It was organized. The neighborhood meeting had started as a chance to clear the air, but it ended with the whole block realizing they were caught in something far bigger than overgrown lawns and missing playground equipment. And as the storm clouds gathered again that night, thunder rolling across the horizon, the sense of safety we once had in our quiet cul-de-sac was gone for good. When my daughter finally sat down at our kitchen table, long after midnight, she didn't look tired. She looked resolved. "They won't stop," she said simply. "They'll double down. And if Karen was desperate enough to pull a gun, imagine what the rest of them are willing to do when they feel cornered." Her words landed heavy, and I knew she was right. The board had shown its teeth. The fight ahead would be uglier, more dangerous, and far from over. The neighborhood had reached its breaking point, and the lines were drawn. On one side were ordinary people who just wanted peace. On the other were those who'd built power from fear and fraud, and they weren't about to give it up. The turning point had come, and from here it was a battle for the soul of the street. The neighborhood had always looked picture-perfect, the kind of place you'd see on a real estate brochure. White picket fences, kids riding bikes, neat lawns edged like they were cut with scissors. But now the glossy cover had peeled away, and what lay underneath was raw and dangerous. With the HOA president on the run, half the board scattered, and Karen sitting in a county holding cell, our little cul-de-sac felt more like a crime scene than a community. People locked their doors tighter, security cameras popped up overnight, and every conversation was whispered like someone was always listening. My daughter wasn't rattled, though. She doubled down. She kept digging into the money trail, tracing it past the shell companies, past the supposed contractors, until she landed on a developer with a reputation dirtier than a storm drain. The HOA dues hadn't just been skimmed. They'd been funneled into private pockets to grease zoning deals and pad retirement accounts. In other words, we weren't dealing with small-town pettiness anymore. We were brushing against organized greed. The neighborhood knew something was coming, and sure enough, it arrived with the force of a hammer. A week after the chaotic meeting, Karen was released on bail. Everyone expected her to retreat, lick her wounds, maybe disappear. But that wasn't Karen. She came back to the neighborhood in the dead of night, and by morning she was standing in her driveway like a returning monarch. The sight of her binder in hand, hair sprayed into its helmet, and that smug half-smile sent shivers through the block. Only this time she wasn't yelling about dues or trash cans. She was whispering promises. She went door to door, flanked by a couple of unfamiliar men in suits who didn't look like they belonged anywhere near a suburban cul-de-sac. They didn't smile, they didn't wave. They just stood like shadows while Karen leaned in close to neighbors' ears. By sundown, half the block had locked their doors tighter. The other half seemed suddenly more loyal to Karen than ever. Fear had returned, sharper than before. My daughter wasn't surprised. "She's not the boss," she told me over coffee that night. "She's the mouthpiece." Someone higher up bailed her out and sent her back to scare everyone quiet. That theory became fact 2 nights later, when another rock came sailing through a neighbor's window, this time with a typed note that read, "Sheriff or not, you don't belong here." It wasn't just intimidation anymore, it was personal. That was when my daughter decided enough was enough. She called another meeting, not in the community center this time, but right there on our street. She wanted Karen and her shadows to see that people weren't afraid anymore. Folding chairs lined the cul-de-sac, porch lights glowed like stage lamps, and nearly every neighbor showed up, some clutching coffee, others carrying baseball bats just in case. Karen strutted out of her house halfway through, binder in one hand, a mocking smirk on her lips. Her men in suits followed, arms folded, daring anyone to challenge them. The air was thick with tension. My daughter stood tall, her badge shining, and began. "This neighborhood doesn't belong to Karen. It doesn't belong to the HOA. It belongs to the people who live here, who work hard every day to make it a home. And tonight we're taking it back." The crowd erupted in cheers, some hesitant, some bold, but all united. Karen raised her binder like a priest with a holy book and shouted over them, "You'll regret this. You think you can just erase the rules? The HOA is bigger than you, bigger than me. You don't know who you're dealing with." And then came the final twist. One of the men in suits stepped forward, pulling out a piece of paper and handing it to Karen. She looked at it, smirked wider, and waved it in the air. "Court order," she shouted. "This entire assembly is illegal. You're all in violation of HOA regulations, and fines will be issued immediately." The absurdity of it was almost comical. Here was a woman fresh out of jail, backed by shady men in suits, still clinging to the idea that paper fines could undo the chaos she'd caused. But my daughter was ready. She pulled out her own stack of papers, copies of bank records, signed checks, notarized statements, and held them high. "Funny thing about court orders," she said calmly. "They don't mean much when the court already has evidence of your fraud." Silence fell like a hammer. The crowd leaned forward. Karen's smirk faltered. Her men exchanged nervous glances, and for the first time, she seemed unsure. The sheriff's backup arrived right on cue, patrol cars rolling into the cul-de-sac, headlights cutting through the night. Officers stepped out, one of them holding a warrant. Karen's men tried to argue, tried to puff up their chests, but the law was undeniable. The warrant wasn't just for Karen. It named the HOA president and several board members who had gone missing. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. The whole rotten core laid bare. Karen cracked then. Her binder slipped from her hands, papers scattering like leaves across the asphalt. She screamed, a raw, furious sound, lunging at my daughter like a cornered animal. But this time, no gun, no power, no backup could save her. Officers pinned her down in seconds, cuffing her while neighbors watched. Some cheered, some cried, some just stood in stunned silence. The queen of the HOA had fallen, not in secrecy, not behind closed doors, but right there in the open, in front of the very people she tried to control. As Karen was dragged away for the second and final time, her voice broke into threats and sobs. "You'll regret this. All of you. They'll come for you too." But her words rang hollow now, stripped of authority. The neighbors weren't afraid anymore. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the patrol cars take her away, and for the first time in weeks, there was something like hope in the air. The aftermath wasn't instant peace. The fraud investigation stretched on for months, uncovering layers of corruption that reached further than anyone imagined. The HOA, as we knew it, was dissolved, replaced by a volunteer committee run by actual neighbors who cared about the community. Property values didn't collapse. In fact, they rose because people wanted to live in a place that had fought back and won. Karen disappeared into the court system, her once feared name reduced to a punchline whispered over backyard barbecues. My daughter didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. She just went back to work, back to her duty, as if dismantling a corrupt HOA was just another day on the job. But sometimes, late at night, she'd sit on the porch with me, staring at the quiet street. "It wasn't just about money," she said once, her voice low. "It was about control. People will always try to take it, and people will always have to stand up and take it back." The neighborhood never forgot that lesson. The cul-de-sac looked the same on the outside, lawns trimmed, kids laughing, dogs barking. But under the surface, things had changed. People trusted each other more. They stood up for one another. And whenever anyone joked about HOA rules, the laughter came a little sharper, edged with the memory of the night Karen pulled a gun and the sheriff's daughter stood her ground. It was a story no one believed until they lived it, a mix of comedy, chaos, and danger. And though the fear had passed, the legend remained. HOA Karen had tried to run the street like a kingdom, but in the end, the kingdom pushed back.